Hello, my name is James Sinnis. I'm a physics student in the PhD program at the University of Washington, but today I'm going to be talking about some research I was involved in while I was working at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where we were studying mass transport and breaking waves in a laboratory setting. Before I get started, I'd like to thank all my co-authors who are listed here, in particular Nick for all his help in putting together this talk, and also to all the other members of our group. So first, I'm going to give some background and motivation for why surface waves and wave breaking are important, and why specifically understanding wave-induced mass transport is important in the context of coupled air-sea models. So surface waves and wave breaking are of interest to people who make coupled air-sea models because they exchange mass, momentum, and energy between the atmosphere and the ocean. In particular, wave-induced mass transport exchange is indicative of the exchange of momentum between the atmosphere and the ocean. On top of that, wave-induced mass transport introduces vorticity into the upper ocean, and that vorticity seeds mixing between the upper ocean and deeper parts of the ocean, which changes the temperature of the upper ocean and thus changes the thermal boundary condition in coupled air-sea models. Now, this is also of interest, obviously, to people who want to model the movement of mass across the surface of the ocean. So the question that we're trying to answer today, or at least improve our answer to today, is what is the total wave-induced mass transport at the surface of the ocean? So first, let's look at how that question is currently being answered. So the way we currently answer this question is with the Stokes drift. Now, this was first derived in 1847 by Sir George Stokes. And the idea is that if a wave is moving from left to right in this diagram, a particle will move on these loops, but the loops aren't totally closed and there's this net forward drift. And he derived this in the case of a linear, monochromatic, and irrotational waves. So under those conditions, this holds quite well. Now, let's look at what waves can actually look like at sea. Now, in a sea like this, those conditions on the wave that Stokes was studying clearly do not apply. So how important are the effects that Stokes drift doesn't capture? So what we're looking at specifically is the mass transport induced by breaking waves. So to understand that, to be able to estimate that at sea, we have to understand the mass transport induced by a single breaking wave. And then we can use statistics to apply that knowledge to try and estimate the total mass transport due to breaking at sea. So even the problem of a single breaking wave is quite complicated. It's a two-phase turbulent flow, so it's very difficult for theory or numerical, for us to approach this problem theoretically or numerically. So it's best to just measure it. And it's best to measure it in the laboratory because if you were trying to measure it at sea, there's so many other things happening that isolating the signal of the mass transport of just a breaking wave is extremely difficult. So we approach this problem with laboratory studies. The technique we use in the lab to do this is called the dispersive focusing technique. So what we do is we generate these waves, wave packets like this at one end of the wave tank. And the waves are pretty much linear at this point. We have the longer wavelength components that are generated at a later time than the shorter wavelength components. Now, because of the dispersion relationship, the longer wavelength components move faster than the shorter ones. So they all sort of pile up and the wave packet focuses and gets very steep in this midpoint of the wave tank, which is called the breaking region. And in the breaking region, we take direct measurements of quantities that we're interested in. So in this experiment, the quantity we're interested in is the transport. And now, what's powerful about these about this technique is that you can control the initial conditions with certain parameters that determine the initial condition, the wave packet that you generate. And you can actually draw up causal relations and deterministic relationships between these initial conditions that you control with these wave packet parameters and the quantities of interest in the breaking region. So when we're in the lab, our question becomes, how can we write transport as a function of some wave packet parameters, and what are those parameters? So the wave packet that I showed you in the last slide can be described with this Fourier series here, where the amplitudes are a sub n, the wave numbers are k sub n, and frequencies are omega sub n, and it breaks at xb and at time tb. So the parameters that characterize this wave packet that are of interest for the transport are actually the strength of breaking S, which is the maximum linear prediction of the slope of the free surface, which you can actually get just by summing a sub n, the amplitudes, times the wave numbers. the bandwidth, which is the range of frequencies involved in this wave packet here, and it is then normalized by the central frequency omega sub c. So these three variables or parameters determine the net transport. And so what I have in red here is effectively our final result of this paper. We have what we found is that we can write the net transport normalized by the central wave number, which is related to the central frequency by the dispersion relationship. We can write the net transport normalized by the central wave number as a function of s minus s star and the bandwidth. And s star is the s value at which waves start breaking. So it's the minimum s value at which we will observe breaking. So this value is never less than 0 in the case of breaking waves. So what is S qualitatively? So increasing S, as can be seen here, increases the height of the wave when it's breaking. So it sort of sets the vertical length scale of the breaker. It also increases the energy dissipation during breaking, but we can think of it mainly in the context of this experiment as setting the vertical length scale of the breaking wave as well as the breaking induced flow. Now, the bandwidth, on the other hand, is a bit more difficult to illustrate, but the idea is very similar. The idea is actually that it sets the horizontal length scale of the breaking induced flow. So what we have here is two different wave packets of the same S value, but different bandwidths. And what we have here is measurements actually of a particle's trajectory as the wave packet passes, and this is in the breaking case. So the particle starts here around the start of the breaking region. The wave packet approaches and it moves in these loops similar to the Stokes drift, and then the wave breaks and the particle is transported basically to the end of the breaking region. So what we see here is that the width of the breaking region shrinks down as you increase the bandwidth. And you can get this intuition just from the knowledge that when you have a function that is very wide in frequency space, it can get very narrow in real space, just in space. And so that intuition applies here. So what we're specifically looking at in these experiments is the effect of bandwidth on the transport. And so our setup to measure the transport is, like I said, we generate those waves, those wave packets, and then in the breaking region we have two cameras that view the breaking region from above and from the side. And we have these colored neutrally buoyant particles that follow the flow of the water. And we take these and we look at the pictures from this downward-looking color camera, and we click on the initial position and the final position of the particle. So before the wave passes and after the breaking wave passes, we get the total transport. So as a summary of our experiments, we looked at 4 different bandwidths. We looked at a range of S values within each bandwidth, and we took 2,000 to 3,000 individual particle trajectories for each of these bandwidths. Also note here, we did change the central frequency a bit for this bandwidth. That only happened because of some engineering limitations. We're not specifically looking at the central frequency, the effect of the central frequency on the transport. It's not a variable of interest for this experiment. And we chose this range of bandwidths because this is basically the narrowest bandwidth we can get in a wave tank that's 30 meters long. And we're already running into some issues with these narrower banded wave packets. Now, the result of all those measurements is this plot, basically. This plot contains all of those measurements. We have 4 plots here, each one corresponding to a different bandwidth, and these points are color-coded by the slope S. So the non-breaking points are in blue, and the breaking points are in the other colors. Also, the x-axes are the initial location of the particle subtracted by the breaking location of the wave packet, and the y-axes are the transport of a single particle. So you can see there's a big difference between the non-breaking and the breaking cases, but this doesn't really show a ton of the behavior very clearly. So what we do is we bin average these scatter plots and we create these line plots. And now here, something does become very clear quite quickly, is that as you increase S, in these breaking cases especially, the transport increases dramatically. Not only does the maximum transport increase, but the width of the region of significant transport increases as well. I'll also note here just a technical thing. These 2 narrower bandwidth wave packets, it was in the braking cases, it was hard to look at a wide range of S values just because of engineering limitations and the difficulty of making very steep wave packets with narrow bandwidths in a wave tank that's only 30 meters long. So we effectively looked at 1 or 2 S values for each of these bandwidths. But in these wider bandwidth cases, you can clearly see the effect of increasing S. Now, the effect of bandwidth wasn't very clear in that last slide, so what I have here is a slide showing the transport caused by of 2 wave packets of effectively the same S value, but different bandwidths. And here you can see that increasing the bandwidth basically does the opposite of increasing S. When you increase the bandwidth, the maximum transport decreases, and the width of the region where the transport is significant also decreases. So once we have these average transport profiles, we can use them to calculate what I've been calling the net transport, which is the average transport in the region of significant braking-induced drift. So we just take one of these curves and we average over it only in the region where there is significant braking-induced drift, which we determine empirically. Now, the result of that is in this plot. So on the y-axis is the transport, which I've normalized by the central wave number, and on the x-axis is the steepness or strength of braking, S. The points are color-coded by the bandwidths. The circular points are the non-braking wave packets, and the diamond-shaped points are braking wave packets. Now, what you'll see here is we have not normalized for any bandwidth dependence at all. And what we notice is that these different wave packets with different bandwidths, in particular the green and orange points, seem to follow completely different trends in the transport. So this is yet more evidence that the average transport, the quantity that we're actually interested in, the braking-induced transport, varies with S, and varies with the bandwidth, and the bandwidth plays a role in determining that value. So how do we actually figure out how the bandwidth plays a role in determining the transport? To do this, we actually need a physical model of how braking-induced transport is happening. And so our physical model for the transport is actually very simple, and I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can so that we don't get bogged down in too many details. But the idea is basically that there's a braking threshold slope that once it is exceeded, the wave starts to break. Now, the slope of the free surface is determined, we approximate basically by linear theory, because it's determined by constructive interference of the Fourier components. Now, once that braking threshold slope is exceeded, the wave starts to break, and it continues breaking basically until the wave packet has dispersed more, and that critical braking threshold slope is no longer exceeded. So the width of the braking region is determined by the focusing of the wave packet, basically. So when we apply that reasoning here, and we say that the width of the braking region is the appropriate length scale for the transport, then we get this formula for the net transport's dependence on the central wave number, the bandwidth, the slope, and the braking threshold slope. So what happens when we apply this model to our measurements of the net transport? So according to this model, the net transport should scale inversely with the bandwidth, and it should scale like S minus S star to the 1/2 power. So here on the right-hand side, we have applied that model to the plot I showed you earlier of the net transport by normalizing the net transport with the bandwidth and plotting it versus S minus S star rather than just S. And you see that when we do that, all these different trends that the different bandwidths we're following sort of come together and follow a single trend. And we fit that with the model where the coefficient chi sub L is a free parameter, and this vertical offset beta is just our measurement of the maximum non-braking transport. So especially in these cases with these narrow banded wave packets, they are sort of brought into line with the wider bandwidth wave packets. And what this does is basically corroborate to some extent our model. And in particular, it corroborates the inverse dependence of the transport on the bandwidth, because most of this data collapse that we're observing here, it comes just from multiplying the transport by the bandwidth. So to summarize, we've conducted a series of laboratory experiments to investigate the braking-induced transport of a single braking wave. We then created a model to explain some of the dependence of the bandwidth that we discovered. in the transport, in the braking-induced transport. And we hope that in the future we can apply this understanding of the braking-induced transport of a single braking wave to measurements from sea, so we can estimate the effect, the net effect of braking on the wave-induced mass transport on the surface of the ocean. So thank you to the organizers of this conference for giving me the opportunity to present here. And I hope that you have some questions that we can discuss in my Q&A session on Tuesday. So I'm already over time, so this is just sort of an extra thing for people who are interested in or are studying the energy dissipation in surface waves. So basically, the argument that we have for the length scale of the width of the braking region holds some implications that modify the arguments for the braking parameter, which is this dimensionless value that we use to parameterize the energy dissipation in a braking wave. So it actually parameterizes the dissipation rate per unit crest length in a braking wave. Now the current scaling for this, which has been discussed in previous literature, is that B, the braking parameter, should go like S minus S naught to the 5/2 power, where S naught is a free parameter. Now, when we had data from these current experiments, which are these triangles and circles, and we also had some archive data from that was taken for a paper published by David Drazen in 2008, and those points are in diamonds. And when we plotted those data points on this current fit, or on this current scaling, we noticed that the different experiments, these diamond points and the rest of the points, sort of fell in different clusters. And also, interestingly, the different bandwidths followed different trends. And although all of this data on the whole looks like it's just following the trend, but with some scatter, if you look at the different bandwidths, it's clear that the different bandwidths don't follow the trend at all. So these green points, for instance, are clearly much steeper than the trend, as well as these dark blue points here. And also the different bandwidths follow different trends from each other. So these orange circles follow a different trend from these green circles and triangles. And so we figured that, so this is evidence also that the bandwidth might play a role in determining the braking dissipation. And like I said, our argument for the length scale of the width of the braking region implies some modifications for the braking parameter B scaling. And included in that modification is an inverse dependence on the bandwidth. So according to our argument for the length scale of the braking region, the braking parameter or the energy dissipation should scale inversely with the bandwidth, and it should scale like with S minus S star rather than just S minus some free parameter. So we have the x-axis here with our modified scaling is S minus S star, and the y-axis we have normalized by the bandwidth delta. And this hasn't really reduced the scatter in the plot significantly. It's not like everything falls on this line perfectly, but what it does do is it makes these big differences between the bandwidths and between the experiments sort of go away, so that we see that although there is still a lot of scatter, the different bandwidths and the different experiments all sort of follow the same trend. So it sort of unifies the behavior of this data set. And now there's plenty of other data of this that we haven't included in this plot, just because we don't have measurements of their braking threshold slope, so we couldn't do a fair comparison here. But we think that in our data set, and according to our model, the bandwidth should scale inversely, the braking parameter should scale inversely with the bandwidth. And this is possibly interesting for people doing studies of the energy dissipation and braking waves in the future. So thank you again to the organizers of this conference, and also again, I hope you have the time to come to my Q&A session on Tuesday. Thank you.